Tired of hard-coding OAuth credentials for different providers like Auth0, Google, or Azure in your FastMCP server? We'll configure the entire authentication system through environment variables, keeping credentials secure and making provider switching effortless. You'll see how to set up the required provider implementation, OAuth client details, and exact URL matching for callback validation, plus optional parameters like custom redirect paths, required scopes, and issuer URLs that work consistently across all supported providers. Specify the provider implementation. Export FastMCP server auth equals FastMCP server, auth providers, auth0 provider. Provider-specific credentials. Export FastMCP server auth0 config URL equals https / well-known / OpenID configuration. Export FastMCP server auth0 client ID equals tvtoab nga zawwh hiker 7bz1 lutmxln smsb. Export FastMCP server auth0 client secret equals vp icgem. Export FastMCP server auth0 audience equals https / export FastMCP server auth0 base URL equals https / localhost 8000. This demonstrates environment-based provider configuration for authentication systems using FastMCP's provider implementation approach. The technique externalizes all provider-specific settings, including OAuth credentials, OpenID Connect endpoints, and token requirements, into environment variables, enabling runtime selection of authentication methods without code modifications. The key distinction is how it supports both OAuth flows and JWT verification through the same configuration mechanism, while enforcing strict URL matching requirements between your server and the identity provider. The system works by reading a standardized set of environment variables that define both the provider implementation and its parameters. Required variables like FastMCP server auth specify the provider class, while provider-specific variables, prefixed with FastMCP server auth provider, configure endpoints, credentials, and security settings. The base URL serves as both the OAuth redirect root and public endpoint base, requiring exact protocol host path matching with the provider's allowed callback URLs. Optional parameters like required scopes, defaulting to OpenID, redirect path, defaulting to auth callback, and issuer URL, defaulting to base URL, allow fine-tuning without sacrificing the declarative configuration approach. This approach solves critical production challenges by eliminating hard-coded credentials while supporting multiple authentication providers through identical configuration patterns. The environment-based design enables seamless environment switching and credential rotation without downtime, while the strict URL validation prevents OAuth callback mismatches. The trade-off is initial setup complexity for proper variable naming and URL configuration, but this cost is justified by the security benefits and deployment flexibility, particularly in cloud environments where the same configuration pattern works across Auth0, Google, JWT, and custom providers. Let's break it down line by line. Specify the provider implementation. Export FastMCP server auth equals FastMCP server, auth providers, auth0 provider. This environment variable configures Auth0 as the authentication provider implementation using FastMCP's provider system. It enables both OAuth 2 flows and JWT verification through OpenID Connect, with base URL requiring exact protocol and path matching against Auth0's allowed callback URLs. Required parameters include CONFIG URL, client ID, client secret, audience, and base URL, while optional parameters like issuer URL defaults to base URL, redirect path has default value, and required scopes defaults to OpenID. allow further customization. The same environment variable approach applies to other providers like Google and JWT, maintaining consistency across authentication implementations.
Hash provider-specific credentials. Export FastMCP server auth 0 config URL equals https / well-known / OpenID configuration.
This environment variable configures Auth0's OpenID Connect discovery endpoint, which automatically provides all OAuth 2 OIDC parameters, including authorization, token, and user info endpoints. The base URL must exactly match Auth0's allowed callback URLs, including protocol and trailing slashes, as mismatches will break the OAuth flow. Required parameters include CONFIG URL, client ID, client secret, audience, and base URL, while optional parameters like issuer URL, defaults to base URL, redirect path has default value, and required scopes, defaults to OpenID, allow further customization. This provider implementation approach works uniformly across all authentication types in FastMCP, including OAuth providers like Auth0 Google and JWT verification systems.
Export FastMCP server auth 0 client ID equals tvtoab nga zawwh hiker 7bz1 LUTMXLN SMSB.
This configures Auth0 as the authentication provider using FastMCP's provider implementation system, which supports OAuth 2, JWT, and custom providers through identical environment variable conventions. The client ID and client secret establish secure OAuth 2 OIDC flows, while base URL must exactly match Auth0's allowed callback URLs, including protocol and trailing slashes, to prevent authentication failures. Optional parameters like issuer URL, defaults to base URL, redirect path, defaults to auth callback, and required scopes, defaults to OpenID, further customize the flow. This same environment-based approach applies to all providers, Google, JWT, etc., ensuring consistent configuration while keeping credentials out of code per 12-factor principles.
Export FastMCP server auth 0 client secret equals VP ICGEMG.
This environment variable stores Auth0's client secret for OAuth 2 authentication, proving your application's identity during token requests. It must never be committed to version control or exposed client-side, following 12-factor app principles for credential management. The configuration uses FastMCP's provider implementation system, which supports OAuth, JWT, and custom providers through identical environment variable patterns. Required parameters include CONFIG URL, client ID, client secret, audience, and base URL, with base URL requiring exact protocol and path matching against Auth0's allowed callback URLs. Optional parameters include issuer URL, defaults to base URL, redirect path has default value, and required scopes, defaults to OpenID, for scope validation. This same approach applies to other providers like Google and JWT as documented in FastMCP's authentication system.
Export FastMCP server auth 0 audience equals https //
This configures Auth0 as the authentication provider using FastMCP's provider implementation system, which supports OAuth, JWT, and custom providers. The audience parameter enforces that JWT tokens must be issued for this specific application, while base URL must exactly match Auth0's allowed callback URLs, including protocol and trailing slashes, to prevent OAuth flow failures. Optional parameters like issuer URL, defaults to base URL, redirect path, defaults to auth callback, and required scopes, defaults to OpenID, further customize the OAuth 2 OpenID Connect flow. All credentials are kept in environment variables, following 12-factor principles for secure, provider-agnostic configuration.
Export FastMCP server auth 0 base URL equals https://localhost 8000.
This configures Auth0 as the authentication provider using FastMCP's provider implementation system, which supports OAuth, JWT, and custom providers through the same environment variable approach. The base URL must exactly match Auth0's allowed callback URLs, including protocol and path, as mismatches will break the OAuth flow. Required parameters include CONFIG URL for discovery, client ID secret for authentication, and audience for token validation, while optional parameters like issuer URL, defaults to base URL, redirect path defaults to auth callback, and required scopes defaults to OpenID enable customization. This 12-factor compliant approach keeps credentials out of code while supporting both OAuth flows and JWT verification. Auth0 provider implementation. FastMCP's environment-driven authentication uses standard environment variables to configure Auth0 OAuth integration, following 12-factor principles for clean deployment across environments. The FastMCP server Auth0 base URL must exactly match your Auth0 application's allowed callback URLs, including protocol and path, or authentication will fail with 404 errors during the OAuth redirect. Optional parameters like issuer URL, redirect, path, and required scopes extend the base configuration while maintaining sensible defaults for common use cases.
The configuration that disappears into environment variables becomes the foundation of all security.